There were a total of 14 Apollo missions conducted in between a time span of 14 years from 1961 to 1975. First mission was the Apollo 1. Initially designated a S-204, was planned to be the first crewed mission of the Apollo program, the American undertaking to land the first man on the moon. It was planned to launch on February 21, 1967, as the first low Earth orbital test of the Apollo Command and Service Module. The mission never flew. A cabin fire during a launch rehearsal test at Cape Kennedy Air Force Station Launch Complex 34 on January 27 killed all 3 crew members, Command Pilot Gus Grissom, Senior Pilot Ed White, and Pilot Roger B. Chaffee, and destroyed the command module. The name Apollo 1, chosen by the crew, was made official by NASA in their honor after the fire. Next Apollo mission was Apollo 7. Apollo 7 was the first crewed flight in NASA's Apollo program, and saw the resumption of human spaceflight by the agency after the fire that had killed the 3 Apollo 1 astronauts during a launch rehearsal test on January 27, 1967. The Apollo 7 crew was commanded by Walter M. Skura, with Command Module Pilot Don F. Eisel and Lunar Module Pilot R. Walter Cunningham. Apollo 7 was launched on October 11, 1968, from Cape Kennedy Air Force Station, Florida, and splashed down in the Atlantic Ocean 11 days later. Extensive testing of the CSM took place, and also the first live television broadcast from an American spacecraft. Despite tension between the crew and ground controllers, the mission was a complete technical success, giving NASA the confidence to send Apollo 8 into orbit around the moon 2 months later. Next Apollo mission was Apollo 8. Apollo 8 was the first crewed spacecraft to leave low Earth orbit and the first human spaceflight to reach the moon. The crew orbited the moon 10 times without landing, and then departed safely back to Earth. These 3 astronauts, Frank Borman, James Lovell, and William Anders, were the first humans to witness and photograph the far side of the moon in an Earthrise. Apollo 8 launched on December 21, 1968, and was the second crewed spaceflight mission flown in the United States Apollo space program after Apollo 7, which stayed in Earth orbit. Apollo 8 was the third flight and the first crewed launch of the Saturn V rocket, and was the first human spaceflight from the Kennedy Space Center, located adjacent to Cape Kennedy Air Force Station in Florida. The Apollo 8 astronauts returned to Earth on December 27, 1968, when their spacecraft splashed down in the northern Pacific Ocean. The crew members were named Time magazine's Men of the Year for 1968 upon their return. It is the last Apollo mission for which all 3 crew members are still living. Apollo 9 was the next Apollo mission, flown in low Earth orbit. It was the second crewed Apollo mission that the United States launched via a Saturn V rocket, and was the first flight of the full Apollo spacecraft, the Command and Service Module with the Lunar Module. The mission was flown to qualify the LM for lunar orbit operations in preparation for the first moon landing by demonstrating its descent and ascent propulsion systems, showing that its crew could fly it independently, then rendezvous and dock with the CSM again, as would be required for the first crewed lunar landing. Other objectives of the flight included firing the LM descent engine to propel the spacecraft stack as a backup mode, and use of the portable life support system backpack outside the LM cabin. The 3-man crew consisted of Commander James McDivitt, Command Module Pilot David Scott, and Lunar Module Pilot Rusty Schweikart. During the 10-day mission, they tested systems and procedures critical to landing on the moon, including the LM engines, backpack life support systems, navigation systems, and docking maneuvers. After launching on March 3, 1969, the crew performed the first crewed flight of a lunar module and concluded on March 13 and was a complete success. The next test of the lunar module was conducted above the moon. Apollo 10 was a full-dress rehearsal for the first lunar landing. It was designated an F mission, intended to test all spacecraft components and procedures short of actual descent and landing. After the spacecraft reached lunar orbit, astronaut John Young remained in the Command and Service Module while astronauts Thomas Stafford and Gene Cernan flew the Apollo lunar module to within 14.4 kilometers of the lunar surface, the point at which powered descent for landing would begin on a landing mission. Then they rejoined Young in the CSM, and after the CSM completed its 31st orbit of the moon, they returned safely to Earth. Apollo 10 spent 61 hours and 37 minutes orbiting the moon, for about 8 hours of which Stafford and Cernan flew the LM apart from Young in the CSM, and about 8 days total in space. Additionally, Apollo 10 set the record for the highest speed attained by a crewed vehicle, 39,897 kilometers per hour on May 26, 1969, during the return from the moon. The crew encountered some problems during the flight, pogo oscillations during the launch phase, and a brief, uncontrolled tumble of the LM ascent stage in lunar orbit during its solo flight. However, the mission accomplished its major objectives. Next Apollo mission, Apollo 11 was the American spaceflight that first landed humans on the moon. Commander Neil Armstrong and lunar module pilot Buzz Aldrin landed the Apollo lunar module Eagle on July 20, 1969 at 2017 UTC, and Armstrong became the first person to step onto the moon's surface 6 hours and 39 minutes later, on July 21 at 2:56 UTC. Armstrong and Aldrin collected 47.5 pounds of lunar material to bring back to Earth as pilot Michael Collins flew the command module Columbia in lunar orbit, and were on the moon's surface for 21 hours, 36 minutes before lifting off to rejoin Columbia. Apollo 11 was launched by a Saturn V rocket from Kennedy Space Center on Merritt Island, Florida. They returned to Earth and splashed down in the Pacific Ocean on July 24 after more than 8 days in space. 6.5 hours after landing, Armstrong stepped off Eagle's landing pad and declared,
I'm going to step off the limb now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Apollo 12 was the 6th crewed flight in the United States Apollo program and the second to land on the moon. It was launched on November 14, 1969 by NASA from the Kennedy Space Center, Florida. Commander Charles Pete Conrad and lunar module pilot Alan Elbein performed just over 1 day and 7 hours of lunar surface activity while command module pilot Richard F. Gordon remained in lunar orbit. Shortly after being launched on a rainy day at Kennedy Space Center, Apollo 12 was twice struck by lightning, causing instrumentation problems but little damage. Switching to the auxiliary power supply resolved the data relay problem, saving the mission. Apollo 12 would have attempted the first lunar landing had Apollo 11 failed. But after the success of Neil Armstrong's mission, Apollo 12 was postponed by 2 months. On November 19, Conrad and Bean achieved a precise landing at their expected location within walking distance of the Surveyor 3 robotic probe, which had landed on April 20, 1967. The Apollo 12 mission ended on November 24 with a successful splashdown. Apollo 13 has been called a successful failure because the crew never landed on the moon, but they made it home safely after an explosion of the oxygen tanks crippled their ship, but they returned home safely. Notable for the return of America's first astronaut, Alan Shepard, to space, Apollo 14 also was probably the smoothest lunar landing to that point. Shepard set a new distance record by walking more than 9,000 feet on the lunar surface, pulling a handcart to carry their tools and samples. Apollo 15 was the first mission in which humans drove a car on the lunar surface. Designed for longer stays on the moon, the mission carried a lunar rover, which Commander David Scott and lunar module pilot James Irwin used while they were on the surface for more than 18 hours. They traveled more than 17 miles in the rover, setting up experiments and collecting 170 pounds of samples. Before leaving the lunar surface, Scott conducted an experiment to test Galileo's theory that objects in vacuum, without air resistance, would fall at the same rate. He dropped a geological hammer and a feather, which hit the ground at the same time, proving Galileo right. Apollo 16 and Apollo 17 have nothing extraordinary, but in the last one, Commander Gene Cernan and lunar module pilot Harrison Schmitt, the first scientist astronaut to reach the moon, collected 243 pounds of material. These samples, and those from the previous missions, continue to reveal more about the moon as new tools and techniques are developed and applied. That's all for today. See you in another video.